Welcome to One Symphony, a podcast that explores classical music's relevance in our modern lives. I'm Conductor Devin Patrick Hughes, and I'm here to share with you stories and conversations with musicians, composers, and artistic entrepreneurs that aim to unite us into one symphonic world. Henry Fogel has served as president and CEO of the League of American Orchestras, where he significantly impacted the orchestral landscape by supporting and consulting with over 190 orchestras during his tenure. His leadership as president of the Chicago Symphony for 18 years saw substantial growth in the organization's endowment and community engagement efforts. Henry's extensive career also includes leadership positions at the National Symphony Orchestra of Washington, D.C. and the New York Philharmonic. He is actively involved in various nonprofit boards and serves as chair of the Chicago Classical Music Recording Foundation. Henry's contributions to the American symphonic landscape have been recognized through honorary doctorate degrees and many awards, including the League of American Orchestras Gold Baton Award. Beyond his professional achievements, Henry is an accomplished narrator and producer, sharing his passion for classical music over the radio waves for 5 decades. Henry, thanks so much for joining me on One Symphony today. I would love to start by just asking you about your early life in music and your early career in radio, and how that drove you into orchestra management and to live this mission of making symphonic music more accessible.
Thanks for asking me to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I grew up in a home where classical music was not particularly loved. It wasn't hated, but I would say Broadway musicals was the high end of musical taste there, and things like Frank Sinatra and so forth. But my mother wanted me to take piano lessons, and I did, and I started to fall in love with the music immediately. I never developed to the point where I ever thought I could make a living playing the piano. I wasn't particularly interested in teaching, so when I went to college, I let my mother shape my direction. She was playing my son, the Doctor, so I went to Syracuse University as a pre-med student, and the first time I had to dissect a frog, I fainted. The zoology professor and I both realized that wouldn't do for a doctor. And he happened to be a real music lover, and he and I talked about music all the time. His name was Roger Milkman, and this was very early 1960s in Syracuse. He said to me, "You really need to go into music. I don't know what you do in it since you don't think you're going to be a good enough pianist, but your life should be in music." And so I agreed. I started studying musicology. I kept taking piano lessons. I studied a little composition and theory. I think the interesting decision I made, this was the very early days of FM radio. There was only one FM station in Syracuse. There was a student-run station, but there was one commercial station, and it did a little of everything. And they were looking for an announcer for their 90-minute classical music show. So I auditioned, and I guess I have a reasonably good voice for radio, but also an ability, whether I can speak them or not, to pronounce foreign languages. So I got the job. In 1961, I started announcing on that station. In early 1963, it went bankrupt. And a friend of mine who worked there as an engineer, actually, and I went around to the creditors, told them that the station had very little in the way of assets, that if they gave us a year, we would try to make them whole. It had about $25,000 of debts. So we bought the station for $1, plus assuming the $25,000 of debts, and turned it into a full-time, 18-hour-a-day classical music station, 6 a.m. to midnight, and figuring that we should go after a single audience, but really earn their loyalty and persuade them that they needed to support our advertisers, because this was not public radio. There was no public radio in 1963. So on April the 28th of 1963, we signed on. I used the Bach B minor Mass to begin because I thought we needed a prayer. I ran it for a total of 15 years till 1978. I was the program director. I was also the kind of public face of the station. I wound up being invited to join the board of directors of the Syracuse Symphony in 1967 when I was all of 25 years old, which made me younger than most of the children of most of the other board members. I taped and broadcast their concerts, so I got to see the inner workings of orchestras. I also learned the repertoire, all of the repertoire. If you have to program 18 hours a day of music, you can't do it with the top 40 of classical music. So I learned music of Carl Nielsen before America really discovered him, all kinds of stuff. Public radio came along in 1978. The public television station opened a radio station, and that was really, we thought, they can do this better than we can. They can get contributions that are tax deductible. They can combine the reach of the radio and TV station. So we sold the station. For the station we bought for $1, we sold for $314,000. Unfortunately, we had taken some investors on, so I was only about a 15 or 20% shareholder. But it gave me enough money to at least take a little bit of time to find my next profession. One of the things that we did in 1968 is we did a radio marathon for the Syracuse Symphony. The only example of that was Jerry Lewis's telethon that he does for muscular dystrophy. There was no other broadcast fundraising, radio or television. I was at a board meeting of the Syracuse Symphony, and I said, we ought to try this. And it caught on. And for about 20 years, public radio stations did them for symphony orchestras. Then it died because the stations figured out they could do it for themselves. When you hear on public radio now one of those fund drives, which I'm sorry to say mostly are boring, you can blame me, but I will say mine were never boring. I was invited to go around the country, usually by the radio station who knew me, because that's the business I was in. And I went in 1969 to Cleveland to help WCLV do their first for the Cleveland Orchestra. 1970, Boston. In the 70s and early to mid-80s, actually, I visited probably 20 or 30 different cities and was the on-air anchor of their fundraising radio marathons. That got the orchestra field to know me. So in 1978, I was offered the job of orchestra manager of the New York Philharmonic.
What advice would you give to public radio during their fundraising drives to spice them up a bit?
Oh, stop begging. Stop threatening what would happen if you don't contribute. Make it fun. One of the great moments that I ever had on that was in Vancouver. One of the things that you could buy if you called up and made a contribution was a VIP backstage personal tour of the Vancouver Aquarium, run by the director of the aquarium. He would take you and your family alone backstage. And I just, without thinking, I said, you really ought to take that premium. This is, after all, a radiothon with a purpose. And that started the station host and myself and some of the guests that were on, some of the musicians actually that were on. It just started about 10 minutes of fish jokes. Yes, this will help the orchestra play in tuner. Just give for the hell of it. And it was just terrible. I'll become crabby if you don't do it. I'll be a shell of my former self. Anything you could think of. People started calling in and saying, I'll contribute if they'll stop the fish jokes. So we said, sure, we would stop. And immediately somebody else called and said, no, I'll keep contributing if they continue the fish jokes. So we started contributions for the Vancouver Symphony in the Stop the Fish Joke Fund and the Keep the Fish Joke Going Fund. Raised a couple of $1,000s for and against fish jokes. That's the kind of fun those things can be if you let them be. But I find most of the ones that I hear, I call them begathons, and they're whiny.
I'd love to jump on one of the things you said about your earlier life. It's really funny to listen to you talk because you said you were pre-med and I was also pre-med. I did music as I always thought I was going to play music, but I wanted to help people. I wanted to be there for people and I wanted to make a living. But it was in that college time where I was trying to double major in bio and music. And I also actually had a radio station. It started out as a little more pop with a friend of mine in college. It wasn't to the level of your radio station,
but he left after our end of our freshman year, and then it became all classical. But I'm curious about what you think, because I've seen this a lot, is that crossover between the sciences, particularly medicine and music, and how there's professionals crossing over. Historically, it's like the liberal arts and sciences, the past 600 years of Western European history. You're a full-fledged scientist if you can also play the violin.
There's definitely a connection. Years and years ago, when I was running the League of American Orchestras, I visited many of our member orchestras, and I went to Boston to hear a concert by the Longview Symphony. The Longview Symphony plays at a remarkable level. The main work on that program was the Glagolitic Mass of Janacek, which is a fiendishly difficult work. They played it terrifically. Everybody in that orchestra is a practicing physician. They actually give concerts not to make money. They give concerts to raise money for charities. They donate their services to different charities to sell concert tickets to make money for those charities. Everybody, including the management of that orchestra, they're all doctors. I've heard the student orchestra at MIT. Nobody in MIT is planning to make a career playing in an orchestra, but it's one of the better music school orchestras that I've heard. I've always seen that connection between not just doctors, but scientists in general, physicists in particular. And it's not completely surprising. Music is built on a variety of relationships, mathematical relationships, whether the listener hears them or not. They're there.
The harmonic series, it's not something that we created. It's something that came to us in the form of the birds or the wind or trees. It's amazing that we've been able to harness that energy. I'd love to also ask you about being a board member. Can you talk about how the role of the board of directors of a symphony orchestra has evolved throughout your career?
I'm not totally sure it's evolved in any meaningful ways, except for the fact that I have often run into boards that don't understand their role. The reason for boards in America, and this is very important, most people don't focus on this. Why do we have a board of directors? Most European orchestras either don't have one or they have a small board of some advisors, and in most cases, like the Berlin Philharmonic, the governance decisions are made by a committee of musicians elected by the orchestra. The reason we have the kinds of boards we do in America is we don't have the level of government support that exists in Europe. We have to raise the money privately. And the purpose of the board is it represents the community, particularly the community of donors, who, if they're going to give money, they also want to be sure that it is spent wisely. The boards that recognize their role, first of all, need to understand that their principal role is fundraising. That's why they are there. They have to help the management, the music director, the development director, if there is a big enough staff. They've got to make introductions. They have to open doors. They don't necessarily have to ask for the gift. They have to make the relationships. Then their second, almost equally important function is to assure that the money is spent wisely. But it creates a very interesting problem, Devin, if you think about it. Most corporate boards are made up of people who understand the basics of the business that the corporation is in. Most orchestra and opera boards are made up of people who don't understand the basics of the business. So on the one hand, they are supervising a management that are the professionals. They know less than those professionals, and that can create, and often does, all kinds of problems. I have in my life been in both camps. I'm actually one of the few that spent most of my professional life as an administrator once I left Syracuse from 1978, but also as a board member. I have been a board chair of nonprofit boards. usually of smaller organizations. Chicago Opera Theater is one example where I'm now the immediate past board president. And so I've seen both sides, both roles, the governance role and the management role. And I've spent a lot of time as a board leader keeping my board out of the details of management because they don't always understand. On the other hand, they have to watch the big picture. I've seen nonprofits that have gone completely south, out of business, because the board wasn't paying attention to what was happening on the finances. Boards of either orchestras or opera organizations, number one, must know that there are national service organizations, the League of American Orchestras or Opera America, have data that can help them establish benchmarks for their own institutions. What should an orchestra of your size be raising in contributions? What level of expenses should be artistic versus administrative, and so forth? And those organizations also have great seminars. The problem is board members are volunteers, and some of them don't have the time to take advantage of those resources. Most times when I've seen an orchestra fail, it's been bad management, certainly, but it's also been a board not paying attention to the bad management. It's a very important job, and doing it to the right degree, neither micromanaging your staff nor letting them go free without any supervision. Somebody once said to me that their idea of a board is noses in, fingers out. And I like that.
You worked obviously with the Chicago Symphony, the National Symphony, New York Philharmonic, but you've probably touched so many more in terms of smaller regional organizations, many of whom are interested in growth. I found that the smaller organizations, the board is much more hands-on because they have to be. There may not be an executive director. There may only be a music director. As they make that transition, do you find that it's almost essential to move more away from the kind of daily active board and handing that off to the staff? Or do you see sometimes that balance can remain as organizations grow?
I actually see it as an issue with orchestras that are, if you will, changing their basic style, their basic size. When I was president of the League of American Orchestras, I literally spent 50% of my time on the road visiting orchestras. I told any orchestra they could have me come. The league would pay my travel expenses. The only thing I needed was a minimum of 1 hour with the board because the league had tended to deal mostly with staffs. And I wanted to know what boards needed and what they felt they needed. In my 6 years as president, plus one more as a kind of consultant, I visited 192 American orchestras, which is about half of the professional orchestras in America. You bring up a really good point. A small orchestra may start with no executive director, or maybe an executive director, but no other staff. Who's going to do the marketing? Is the executive director supposed to be an expert in marketing, development, artistic management, programming? It can't be. So often you have the board doing those things. As the orchestra grows and takes on more staff, the board members have to step back. In other words, let's say an orchestra hires a general manager or artistic administrator who works on programming with the music director and makes all the engagements with soloists and so forth. That may free the executive director up to do more fundraising. However, it probably doesn't create room for a marketing director. So the board may have to provide that skill. So yeah, it's very carefully calibrated to the needs of each individual organization. Where I've seen problems, Devin, is where an orchestra has grown, where it now has a bigger, more competent staff, and the board doesn't want to let go of the details. By the way, I've seen that even with large orchestras. When I came to the National Symphony, Washington, it had a board that tended to meddle. One of the problems is they hired managers that were, for the most part, not very good. When I came in 1981, every manager for the previous 30 years, since 1951, every manager had been fired, 10 or 11 of them. And when you have ineptitude on the part of the executive director, the board tends to jump in. And I remember one of my first board meetings. I came in the spring of 1981, and we were discussing at the staff what to do with advertising next subscription season, when in the March or April, when the tickets were about to go on sale. And we had decided to take out 2 half-page ads in the Sunday Washington Post. I mentioned that to a board meeting, and immediately a debate started among the board as to whether we should buy 2 half-page ads or 1 full-page ad, which would be more effective, which would be better bang for the bucks, and so forth. And I sat there for about 5 minutes listening to all people who knew nothing about advertising. These weren't the business people on the board. Frankly, some of them were people whose only function was to manage the family estate. Finally, I raised my hand and I said, "Excuse me, you hired me to manage this orchestra. That's a management decision. We've thought about it. This is what we've concluded, and this is what we're going to do." And to his credit, the board president said, "Henry is right. Let's get out of the weeds." It's particularly difficult if a board has been there. And the other problem can be when the board is in the details, you recruit board members who are good at that. If you no longer need them in the details, can they function in a different way, or is that really their main talent? So all of those are issues.
You talk a lot about engagement with people who may not think they love classical music. Like, how do we get more audiences? I think in America, it seems to be more mixing classical with popular music, catering to the popular culture. In Europe, that's a little more separate from what symphony orchestras seem to do. I'm also curious about board engagement. One of the things that I hear a lot of times, not just in orchestras, but in all nonprofits, is that my board it's uneven in terms of the engagement. Is there a formula or approach that you've seen taken that's been more successful in getting equilateral engagement across the board, so to speak?
You've raised 2 separate questions there that aren't even really interrelated. So let me take the first one. I have been saying for my entire career, the job of orchestras is to matter to people in communities who may never buy a ticket to a subscription concert. And they do that by presenting maybe pops concerts, or by sending ensembles into senior citizens' homes or community museums. I think it's critical that orchestras mean something to the majority of people who live in their community. You're right about the difference in Europe, but of course, again, the issue is with government support. Europe doesn't have the same reliance on ticket sale income that we have in this country. And the other thing is, with government support, they can actually keep ticket prices often more reasonable. It's easier to attract somebody into an art form when the ticket is $30, $40, or $50 than when it's $90 or $100. So that's part of that issue. I think also we have tended, and I say we meaning the classical music industry, has tended to make music more intimidating, and it's beginning to address that. I've been giving speeches since the 1980s on that subject because it infuriates me. The idea that you don't clap between movements. It is, first of all, historically wrong. If you didn't applaud between movements of a Brahms symphony, for example, Brahms would think he failed. If you didn't applaud after the 3rd movement of the Tchaikovsky Pathetique, Tchaikovsky would have been shot. And yet, I've seen some conductors still to this day. I'm sorry to say, Riccardo Muti did it in Chicago. After the 3rd movement, the audience, it's an automatic applause getter. He turned around and yelled, "No, it's not over."
Picking fights with the audience.
Basically demeaning the people who are applauding you. One of the first things I did when I got to the Chicago Symphony, I'm sorry to say, because I liked the guy, was I released the 30-year program annotator of the Chicago Symphony, because he was a musicologist and he wrote notes that only other musicologists could understand. The retrograde inversion of the 2nd fugue theme that resolves on the harmonic 7th. The people who could understand that are the people who least needed the program notes. The people who need them were intimidated and were made to feel like they don't know enough. And in general, I think the jargon, I remember the head of the education department of the Chicago Symphony put out a flyer that was an invitation to meet the assistant conductor at some event. It was, "Meet Maestro Michael Morgan. And I made them reprint it and took Maestro out. But even Daniel Barenboim hated the word and wouldn't allow us to use it and discourage other people from using it. It's an off-putting, distancing word. But in all the ways that we communicate, we need to remove the barriers that make people intimidated by what we do. I think conductors should speak to audiences as a matter of course. It's an odd art form where the principal performer turns his back to the audience and never says anything. And I know that's historically the way it was. That's changing around the country. Last in the biggest orchestras, because they have this European heritage and often European-trained conductors. Riccardo Muti spoke positively a few times to audiences, but also negatively a few times about applauding. But if you go to a Chicago Symphony concert, most of the time, it looks just like a concert looked to Brahms. No other art form is the truth of that. Art form of opera, the whole technology of stage productions has changed. Museums have become much more interactive. They don't look like they looked in 1910. Symphony concerts do, and I think that is something I think orchestras have to keep thinking of.
Before you talk about the board engagement side, I'd just like to piggyback off of one of your comments in terms of the Brahms symphony. Symphonies historically have weighted more to the last movement. They used to be very heavy on the first movement, and then people like Beethoven started adding a chorus to the last movement or adding contrabassoon and trombones and piccolo, etc. When you talked about Brahms and Tchaikovsky, I was just thinking about the Brahms Fourth Symphony, the third movement. It ends so triumphantly. And the Tchaikovsky Symphony third movement ends so triumphantly. I don't know any kind of really mainstream symphonies that do it that way. And I just wonder, and I know the kind of friction that was between Brahms and Tchaikovsky. And just remembering the approximate dates, I think Brahms's fourth was around the early 1880s somewhere. Yeah. Tchaikovsky's sixth was around the early 1890s. I just wonder if Tchaikovsky listened to Brahms and said, hey, that's a pretty cool idea, to give them something just so grandiose to think that maybe it's over, and then just devastated them, both composers in both fourth movements. So I wonder if they were actually truly expecting that applause to happen.
I would think they were, because it's not like you want to keep that mood. The mood changes with the next chord. And the applause was so common in those days. There is, and I don't remember the details of it, there is one story that's true of Brahms at the premiere of one of his symphonies upset that one of the movements didn't get enough applause, and that was a problem for him. I would also say to you that there is somebody who beat them to that, and that's the fourth movement of the Berlioz Symphony Fantastique. One of the things I say is, whoever you invite on the board, there has to be a reason beyond that they're nice. It might be that they give generously. Maybe they aren't engaged. But if you're a relatively small or mid-sized orchestra and somebody's giving you $10,000 or $25,000 a year, and they come to some meetings and they don't come to others and they're not engaged, but they want to be on the board, yeah, you'll let them. That gift is meaningful. But you have to also have board members who bring a skill. If you have a finance committee made up of people who don't know how to read not only a budget, but a P&L and a balance sheet and a cash flow statement, you'll have an incompetent board. It's that simple. If you have a marketing committee, you should have people on it whose profession is marketing. And maybe what they do is they don't design your ads for you unless you need that. But maybe they offer to help you fashion an audience survey and to help you interpret that audience survey. Everybody on the board, and again, I advise boards that you have 3-year terms for a reason. When you re-elect somebody, you should have at least some meaningful percentage of the enthusiasm you had about them when you invited them the first time, when you elected them the first time. If all they do is come to meetings and there's no real contribution, you thank them for their service. I think one of the things I would say is that the orchestras that are largely successful, particularly in the mid and small orchestra size, are ones where the board is engaged.
What goes into, over the decades, what orchestras play? You worked with conductors like Schulte, Barenboim, Rostropovich, And I'd love to hear about the development of the role of the executive director and the CEO in terms of those decisions or other artistic administration. A lot of people, they see the concerts, they see the conductor, they see the orchestra, and they're like, what do people do during the day? So I'd just be curious to hear about that collaboration and how it's evolved.
First of all, it does probably depend a little bit on both the personality of the music director and the executive director, or in some cases, artistic administrator. I'm talking the big orchestras now. George Schulte, to give you an example, did not, number one, he wanted nothing to do with the decision of who the guest conductors would be. He left that up to both me and our artistic administrator at the time, Martha Gilmer. He said, I don't go to concerts. I don't know who's out there. That's your job. He said, I'd like to approve, but in the years I worked with him, he never did not approve anybody. Daniel Barenboim, who had the experience of playing as a soloist with conductors, and in general liked to be a little more hands-on, he did want input into it, and it was a discussion. I'm talking now specifically about guest conductor. I'm told, I haven't worked with him, I'm told Ricardo Muti insists on approving every guest conductor, and that's in his contract. In Daniel Barenboim's contract was that he would consult with the executive director and they would jointly engage guest conductor. And I don't think conductors, frankly, should have that kind of power because they don't, in fact, go to that many other concerts. In terms of the programming, all conductors, if they have either an artistic administrator who knows music or an executive director, they're all willing to listen and take suggestions. I think one of the big surprises to me when I went to the National Symphony was how open Rostropovich was to suggestions. I was only there 4 years, but during my time there, at my suggestion, he conducted the Third Symphony of Carl Nielsen, a symphony, E-flat symphony, I think, of Franz Berwald, and the London Symphony of Vaughan Williams, and some shorter pieces as well. He was very open to it. With George Schulte, I had a very interesting discussion. I had been at the CSO for about a year, and I just got out the sheet that had his entire repertoire, everything he'd ever conducted in Chicago or elsewhere. And I was shocked to discover that the only Shostakovich on it was the First Symphony and the Ninth Symphony, which are the two, if I can make up a word, least Shostakovichian. I said to him, I'm stunned because you're so emotionally attuned to Mahler. Mahler was one of Shostakovich's idols. The music is written for you, in my mind, for you and the Chicago Symphony, and you haven't done any. And he said, yeah, I know. Decca Records has been after me for years. I said, they're right. And to my surprise, he said, okay, if I were to start, I don't want to start with the fifth because everybody does that. What would you recommend? To my shock, I was put on the spot there. I said, to me, the two greatest are 8 and 10. And if I would make an emotional equivalency, the 8th is akin to Mahler 6th. The 10th is closer to Mahler 5.
Mm-hmm.
Said, fine. I think that was in the winter or spring. That summer, he calls me from his place he went to in Italy in the summer. He called me from there. He said, I am studying the 8th Symphony. It is a masterpiece. Thank you. From that point until he died, he learned a new Shostakovich symphony and conducted every year. It also says to me a lot about him. How many conductors, when they're in their early 80s, will learn new major works? That's very rare. He did 8, then he did 10, then he did 5, then he did 13, Bobby Yar, then he did 15, and he did 4, and he was learning 14 on it when he died. With Daniel Barenboim, also, I would find he took suggestions, some he didn't, some he did, but you could discuss it with them. I mean, it's funny, and I think this is probably true for the big orchestras. People would ask me, who makes the programs, you, Daniel Barenboim, or Martha Gilmer, who was the artistic administrator? And my answer was always, yes, all three. I've actually helped mediate tension between an executive director, new executive director usually, and a music director who says, let's say you've been a music director of an orchestra and you program whatever the hell you want to program. And now a new executive director is hired and they have ideas. You might resent that. Shouldn't, but you might. And I have a couple of times been called in and mediated relationships between executive directors and music directors. And usually the one that's hardest is the music director because he's trying to preserve his sole authority. It's an artistic decision, and I'm in charge of artistic decisions. Mm-hmm. That's Fraser. My answer is, if you decided next year to play the complete works of Elliott Carter and Pierre Boulez, does the organization have to accept that? No, of course, but I would never do that. I said, you've now admitted that there's a marketing component to program. That's what the executive director brings. They also bring a cost component. Daniel Barenboim wanted to take the Rite of Spring to Japan. I knew that even for the Chicago Symphony, that's 7 extra players. I did the math for a 3-week tour, 3 weeks of salary, 3 weeks of per diem, hotel, and all travel, overseas and local. And I said, Daniel, to do the Rite of Spring will cost us above our normal expenses $175,000. Daniel Barenboim looked at me and said, oh my God, that's ridiculous. No, we'll do something else. So you've got to have the manager who's not afraid to bring up things like that, and the conductor who's willing to say, oh yeah, that doesn't make sense. Ironically, by the way, 2 years later, he wanted to take John Corigliano's First Symphony to Europe, which is a piece we commissioned and he recorded, and it has just as many extra players. And of course I said yes. Because it was our piece, and it would get all kinds of publicity on a European tour. Doing the Rite of Spring would not get any more publicity than doing something else. So the management needs to understand the subtleties, and the conductor needs to be willing to listen to the subtle.
I'm always fascinated by how conductors, as they get older, and maybe this is less true now, but they really specialize. As you said, Schulte hadn't done any Shostakovich, but then all of a sudden he did. A conductor like Carlos Kleiber did only a few, very few pieces, but he supposedly knew all the repertoire. Those are maybe two different extremes. I'm curious if you have any thoughts around music directors being a little more general practitioners.
It will be interesting to watch some of the conductors that are now in, let's say, their 60s, like Manfred Honig, who currently learns new music and does it with some regularity. I'm interested to see if he will do that in his 70s or 80s. I think the majority of conductors tend not to learn new stuff at that age. Nobody was more adventurous as a programmer in his youth or prime than Leonard Bernstein. But Leonard Bernstein's last 7, 8, 9 years were rehashing the same works that he had been doing. And Daniel Barenboim would learn some new things. He wanted to commission pieces near the end, but less and less. I'm 81, and I can tell you, you have less energy when you're 80 than you did when you were 60. You just have less energy. There's no getting around that. And so it doesn't surprise me. I had a conversation backstage with Riccardo Muti. He did the Shostakovich 13th Symphony. He happened to give its non-Russian premiere when it was first done in Italy. And he did it in Chicago a couple of years ago. To my knowledge, the only Shostakovich symphony he does. And I was talking with him. I never worked with him, but he knows who I am. He knows I used to manage the orchestra. I said, you really felt so natural in that. You should do more Shostakovich. He looked at me and says, oh, we are as bad as and he pointed to the artistic administrator, Christina Rocca. Said, you're as bad as Christina. You want me to work hard. I don't want to learn that new stuff anymore. Very open about it. I think that's the norm, is that as you get into your 70s and 80s, Carlos Kleiber's a fluke. He did that early in his career. He limited himself to 15 pieces of music or something. And he did. I never worked with him, but he did conduct the Chicago Symphony twice. And Martha Gilmer, the artistic administrator, and some of the musicians said, you could talk to him about any piece of music. He knew them all intimately, but he just didn't feel like learning them, conducting them. But he, in the end, for heaven's sakes, in the end, he hardly conducted at all.
Compared to somebody like Valery Gergiev or something.
Yes, there's another opposite end of the spectrum, too.
So I would just be curious to hear about your thoughts on music availability. Orchestras don't really record to make money anymore. It's really just more about to get the orchestra's name out there. That's affected the American classical music industry.
Certainly, the loss of income, not so much for the orchestral organization, but for the musicians of the top 5 or 6 orchestras. When I came to the Chicago Symphony in 1985, most musicians were making between $6,000 and $8,000 a year in advances from Decca Records for the Schulte recordings they were making. Now they're making nothing, or maybe tiny bit that's still required as a payment. And the reason is not that there's a decrease in the interest in buying records. It's that your recording is now one of 200 instead of one of 15 of any given piece. My first profession was programming and running a classical music radio station. I remember where if, in fact, you wanted to play a recording of any one of the 6 symphonies of Carl Nielsen, you imported it from Denmark, or you went to the Danish consulate and asked them to send you a recording with Thomas Jensen and the Royal Danish Orchestra of the Nielsen Fourth Symphony. And that was true through the 60s, when in the Nielsen centenary, Leonard Bernstein made 2 just brilliant recordings of the Nielsen Fifth and the Third. And that began to call some attention to Nielsen music. Now, Herbert Blomstedt has recorded the 6 as a cycle twice, and there are probably 30 to 40 recordings of each Nielsen symphony. It's very hard now to discover a composer that's unrecorded. I think it's a good thing generally, but what it has done is, and you pointed it out, orchestras no longer record for money. They record to document their performances, to get the name out there, to keep the name out there, but not for money. I mentioned Manfred Honeck. He's been recording standard repertoire, but usually often coupling it with a premiere, introducing no music because you want to buy that recording of Tchaikovsky 5 or whatever. It's changed so enormously. I can tell you, for example, when I worked at the New York Philharmonic, and actually after, when I went to Washington, but I was still in close touch with the Philharmonic, the New York Philharmonic had been under contract to Columbia Records, later CBS, and later Sony, since the days of Dmitri Mitropoulos, and then Leonard Bernstein, I think even Artur Radzinsky back then, before Bernstein, through the Pierre Boulez years, and the first 6 or 7 or 8 Zubin Mehta years. I think after the first 3, 4, 5 years of Mehta, they dropped the contract. They dropped the contract because in the first 3 years after a record was made, it was failing to sell 75,000 copies. If you made a recording today that sold 20,000 copies, you would call it a hit. That's the difference. And what happened with Mehta and the New York Philharmonic started replicating itself with the other orchestras. There was a brief respite in the mid-'80s because of compact discs, and that created a new market. It also, by the way, you'll be interested in this, I think your listeners will be. Most people didn't realize this. The record industry themselves admitted, I've talked to executives, that they failed to know that about somewhere between 25 and 30% of the sales of LPs were due to replacing scratched LPs.
It's a good business model.
Yes, except what's not a good business model is then developing a format that doesn't scratch. And they never accounted for that in their projections. So the drop in sales surprised them. But anyway, the CD revolution kept it going for orchestras through the early 90s. But now the Chicago Symphony has its own label, as many orchestras do now. It's not a money-making label. It's exactly for the reason you said, and get their recordings out there. If they sell 10,000 copies of anything worldwide, they consider it a great success. Back in the day, with the Schulte recordings, it was, and he was a recording superstar and he had a cult following. Even when I was there in the mid-'80s, 75 to 125,000 would be sold worldwide in the first 3 or 4 years. Interestingly, by the way, roughly 1/3 in the United States, roughly 1/3 in Europe, and roughly 1/3 in Japan. Not all of Asia, Japan. China was pirating them, of course, and there was some sales in Korea. There was some sales in South America, but those were the 3 big markets. And in fact, one of the reasons for orchestras touring in those days was to market their recordings.
And I wonder today, you have people listening on streaming platforms. You also have them listening on free platforms like YouTube. I bet you there's probably more listening than there was, but it just doesn't channel back to the orchestra musicians or the soloist or whoever's creating it.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And now it's hard for orchestra musicians because they don't get superstar soloist fees. Soloists and conductors, they look at recordings as promotion of themselves. They know it's not money.
Do you think that idea of all orchestras kind of recording has homogenized the orchestral sound? Chicago Symphony had its own sound. You could turn on any recording and you could identify, and I think you could do that pretty easily with the Berlin Philharmonic too in the Von Karajan era. An orchestra under certain conductors with certain brass sections would really have their own sound. I wonder, do you think that's homogenized like sound across the top orchestras at all?
It is to a very large degree, but I don't think recordings have anything to do with it. In the early 1960s, you'll be surprised at this connection that I'm going to point out to you, but it's absolute fact. In the interest of making orchestra jobs available to people of color and making them open to everyone, the union and symphony managements agreed to change the approach to auditioning. It used to be Fritz Reiner, George Sell, they would ask the principals of whatever section was, who do you know? And who you know, who is that going to be? It's going to be a student. First of all, it's one of the reasons that musicians taught students was it allowed them to get a similar sound in their sections. So you've got people in orchestras who studied with the same group of teachers. Chicago, by the way, the civic orchestra, the training orchestra of the CSO, back in those days, I think between 50 and 60% of the people who won auditions had played in the civic orchestra. That's still somewhat true at the Chicago Symphony, because even when there's a national audition, if you played in the civic orchestra, you know the style, you know the sound. But the open auditions, and that's not just national, that's worldwide. The number of Asian players that you see in the Berlin Philharmonic, the number of French plays you'll see in a German orchestra, all of this, that's more responsible than recordings for, to some degree, homogenizing the sound of orchestras. And it's why, for example, most Russian orchestras still sound like Russian orchestras. The wobbly horns that used to sound like they were underwater is not true anymore. But they still have similar sound. That's because, frankly, not a lot of musicians from other parts of the world want to play in a Russian orchestra.
That's really interesting. I didn't really put that 2 and 2 together. Henry, I just wanted to thank you on behalf of the younger generation of musicians who are trying to share this music and trying to make orchestras relevant and connect them to our communities. Thank you for all your service throughout your life in this respect and for paving the way for us. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me on One Symphony today.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I consider myself very lucky. I went to work in what I love. I don't sell insurance. I don't manage a bank. I work in what I love. And I remember once in a Chicago Symphony concert, my wife said to me when it was over, just think, it's a requirement of your job that we hear the Chicago Symphony every week. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Henry. And I would just add, I know you had a great time in your life, but I know the work involved in getting these things going, and just thank you for your commitment to it.
I appreciate that very much.
Thanks, Henry.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us on One Symphony. Thanks to Henry Fogel for sharing his wealth of wisdom. Musical selections on the show today include Bach's Mass in B minor by the Netherlands Bach Society and Jos van Veldhoven, Janáček's Glagolitic Mass by the Czech Philharmonic and the Prague Philharmonic Choir, Beerwald's Symphony No. 4 in E-flat major by the Berlin Philharmonic and Igor Markovich, Shostakovich's Symphony No. 9 by Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic, Corigliano's Symphony No. 1 by Daniel Barenboim and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, Nielsen's Symphony No. 5 by Leonard Bernstein and the Royal Danish Orchestra. You can always find more info at onesymphony.org, including a virtual tip jar if you'd like to support the show. Please feel free to rate, review, and share the show. Until next time, thank you for being a part of the music.